The cold was a discipline. Caleb Vance understood it, respected it, and had built his life within its unyielding embrace. Here, tucked into a fold of the Blue Ridge Mountains, winter was not a season, but a state of being, a fortress of ice and silence that mirrored the one he had constructed around his heart. His cabin, built of sturdy, dark-timbered logs, stood as a solitary outpost against the wilderness and the world. Inside, everything had its place. The floorboards were swept clean, the single cast-iron pan hung precisely over the wood-burning stove, and the books on his one shelf stood in a stoic line, their spines unbroken. It was a life of military precision, a barracks of one, the only way he knew to keep the chaos of memory at bay. At 42, his body was still a weapon, broad-shouldered, corded with muscle honed by years as a Navy SEAL. But his spirit was a frozen battlefield, littered with the ghosts of a war he could never win. Each morning began before the sun, with the sharp, metallic snap of the pump as he drew water from the well. The frigid air was a physical blow, a reminder of being alive that felt more like a punishment than a gift. He would move through a series of stretches, his joints protesting the cold, his mind a blank slate he deliberately wiped clean. The routine was his armor, each task a plate of steel locked into place. Chop wood, check the perimeter, clean his rifle, read a chapter. The silence was his constant companion, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the moan of the wind through the pines, and the frantic drumming of his own heart whenever it dared to remember. There was a room at the back of the cabin that remained locked. He held the only key, a small, simple piece of brass that felt heavier than any piece of equipment he had ever carried. Behind that door was the life he had abandoned, the life that had been stolen from him. Elena's watercolor paintings leaned against the wall, unfinished landscapes of a future they would never see. Her favorite scarf, a slash of vibrant crimson silk, lay folded in a cedar box on a small dresser, its scent of lavender and sunshine long faded but still achingly present in his memory. It was a tomb, a memorial. He could neither bring himself to dismantle nor bear to enter. The grief was a physical presence in the cabin as real as the stone hearth, a shadow that stretched and clung to him no matter how high he built the fire. And there was another ghost, one of 4 paws and unconditional loyalty. Rex, his military working dog, a magnificent German shepherd whose intelligence and courage had been a light in the darkest corners of the world. Rex had died in his arms, a victim of the same blast that had shattered Caleb's leg, his soul. The memory of the dog's last trusting gaze, the warmth of his blood on Caleb's hands, was a wound that refused to scar over.
Whoa!
He sometimes thought he could still feel the phantom weight of Rex's head on his knee, hear the soft thud of his tail against the floor. It was the loss of that pure, uncomplicated devotion that had finally broken him, sending him retreating from a world that had taken everything he loved. He had sworn off connection, off attachment, off the vulnerability that came with letting another living thing into the fortress of his heart. That night, the discipline of the cold escalated into a full-blown assault. A blizzard descended from the peaks, swirling vortex of white fury that erased the world. The wind howled like a legion of grieving souls, rattling the window panes and piling snow in deep sculptural drifts against the cabin walls. Caleb sat by the fire, the book in his lap, unread, listening to the storm's siege. It was a sound he understood, a reflection of the tempest that had raged inside him for 2 years. He felt a grim kinship with its raw, untamed power. The storm asked for nothing and took everything. It was honest in its brutality. He stoked the fire, the familiar, repetitive motion, a small anchor in the churning chaos, without and within. It was just after 3 in the morning when a new sound pierced the storm's symphony, a scratching. It was faint at first, a weak, desperate sound, almost lost in the gale. Caleb froze, his senses, long dormant, but never dull, snapping to full alert. His hand went instinctively to the hunting knife on his belt. It could be a branch, a trick of the wind. But then it came again, more insistent this time, a frantic, rhythmic scraping against the heavy oak of his door, followed by a low, guttural whine that was undeniably the sound of an animal in distress. His first thought was a predator, a bear awakened from its torpor, a mountain lion driven down by the storm. His body tensed for combat. He rose silently, his movements fluid and economical, and moved to the small window beside the door. He wiped the condensation from the pane with the heel of his hand and peered out into the maelstrom. His porch light cast a weak golden circle into the blinding white, and in its faint glow he saw a shape. It was not a predator. It was a huddled, snow-dusted mound of fur collapsed against his doorstep. As he watched, the shape stirred, a head lifted, its noble silhouette unmistakable even through the driving snow. A German shepherd. The animal tried to stand, legs trembling, and gave another weak scratch at the door before collapsing again, its muzzle resting in the snow. Caleb's breath caught in his throat, his carefully constructed wall of detachment cracked. This was not a threat to be neutralized. It was a plea to be answered. He saw not just a stray dog, but a reflection of Rex, a specter of loyalty and courage, brought to his very door. He hesitated for only a second, the soldier in him warring with the man. The soldier saw a breach in the perimeter, a disruption to the mission of solitude. But the man, the one he had tried so hard to bury, saw a creature on the brink of death, a fellow soul lost in the storm. And in that moment, something shifted. He looked into the animal's exhausted eyes, a flicker of dark amber in the swirling snow, and saw not aggression, but a desperate, bone-deep plea for sanctuary. That look broke through his frozen defenses like an ice pick. Without another thought, he unbolted the door. A blast of wind and snow tore into the warmth of the cabin, scattering ashes from the hearth. The dog on the porch lifted her head again, a low growl rumbling in her chest, but it was a sound of warning, not of aggression. It was a sound that said, "I am here, and I am not alone." Caleb's gaze followed hers to the edge of the porch, where three small, shivering bundles of fur were huddled together against the base of a snow-caked log pile. Puppies. The mother had not come seeking shelter for herself. She had led her litter to the one point of light and warmth in a world of frozen darkness, and then spent her last reserves of strength asking for entry. The internal winter that had held Caleb captive for 2 years finally showed a crack. His mission parameters changed in an instant. The objective was no longer solitude, it was survival. He grabbed a thick wool blanket from the back of his chair and his heavy-duty flashlight. His training kicked in, overriding the emotional paralysis. Assess the situation, secure the vulnerable, establish a safe zone. He pulled on his boots and coat, his movements sure and swift. He stepped out onto the porch, into the teeth of the blizzard, the wind a physical force trying to push him back. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken to another living creature in weeks. The mother dog watched him, her body tense, but she did not move. She seemed to understand that he was not a threat. He approached the puppies first, knowing the mother would not leave them. They were tiny, barely more than a few weeks old, their fur caked with ice. 2 were huddled together, shivering violently. The third was dangerously still. Caleb gently scooped them up into the wool blanket, their small bodies feeling impossibly fragile in his large, calloused hands. He tucked the blanket securely under one arm and turned back to the mother. "All right, girl." "Your turn," he murmured. She whined softly, her eyes fixed on the bundle in his arms. Getting her inside was another challenge. She was weak, her legs barely able to support her weight. He knelt beside her, ignoring the biting cold that seeped through his jeans. He put a hand on her neck, feeling the trembling beneath the coarse, wet fur. "You did good," he told her, the words coming unbidden. "You got them here. Now let me help." He slid his arms under her, one beneath her chest and one under her hind legs. With a grunt of effort, he lifted her. She was lighter than she should have been, a testament to her long ordeal. She didn't struggle. merely rested her head against his shoulder with a sigh of complete and utter exhaustion. He carried her and her precious cargo across the threshold and kicked the door shut against the raging storm. The sudden silence and warmth of the cabin were jarring. He gently laid the mother dog on the hearthrug, as close to the fire as was safe, and then unwrapped the blanket containing the puppies next to her. Two of them immediately began to squirm and nuzzle against their mother's belly, but the third, the one that had been so still, lay limp and cold. Caleb's heart, a muscle he thought had atrophied, gave a painful lurch. He had seen death in many forms, but the sight of this tiny innocent life on the verge of being extinguished struck him with a surprising force. He refused to let the storm claim this one, not here, not in his sanctuary. He went to the locked room. Without hesitation he turned the key, the metallic click echoing in the quiet cabin. He opened the door and was hit by the faint, ghostly scent of his past. He ignored the paintings, the memories, the crushing weight of his grief. He went straight to the cedar box on the dresser, his fingers fumbling with the latch. He took out Elena's crimson scarf. The silk was cool and smooth in his hands, a fragile relic from another life. He returned to the hearth and gently wrapped the smallest puppy in the vibrant fabric, the color a shocking slash of life against the dark floor. He held the tiny bundle in his hands, his own body heat, a desperate offering against the encroaching cold. He rubbed the puppy's back with his thumb, mimicking the mother's licking, whispering words of encouragement. He didn't even realize he was saying, "Come on, little fighter, come on." For long minutes there was nothing. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the contented whimpers of the other two puppies, nursing, and the mother's exhausted breathing. Caleb felt a familiar despair begin to creep in. The cold certainty of failure. But then he felt it. A flicker of movement, a tiny convulsive shiver. The puppy let out a weak squeak, a sound so small it was almost lost. Caleb's breath hitched. He continued to rub, to coax, to will life back into the tiny body. Slowly, miraculously, the shivering became stronger, the breathing more regular. He placed the silk-wrapped puppy next to its mother, and it instinctively began to root for a teat, its tiny tail giving a tentative wag. Caleb sat back on his heels, the tension draining out of him, leaving him feeling hollowed out and strangely profoundly alive. He had breached his own defenses, and in doing so had won a battle he hadn't known he was fighting. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude, was now a field hospital, a nursery, a sanctuary. It was chaos. It was life. And for the first time in a very long time, Caleb Vance did not feel entirely alone in the dark. The next few days were a blur of clumsy, determined caregiving. Caleb's rigid, sterile routine was shattered, replaced by the messy, demanding, and utterly compelling needs of his new charges. His cabin, once a monument to order, was now a landscape of happy destruction. There were muddy paw prints on the clean floorboards, a perpetually overturned water bowl near the door, and the faint, earthy smell of milk and puppy breath. He slept, in short, interrupted bursts on the floor by the hearth, waking at the slightest whimper, his soldier's instincts repurposed for a mission of nurturing. He found himself talking to them, his voice a low, soothing rumble, as he mashed up canned food with warm water for the mother, or cleaned the puppies with a damp cloth. The mother, whom he had started calling Sheba for her regal, quiet dignity, recovered her strength quickly. She was a constant, watchful presence, her amber eyes following his every move. There was no fear in her gaze, only a deep, abiding trust that humbled him. She had chosen him, had gambled the lives of her children on the hope of a stranger's mercy, and he was determined not to fail her. She would nudge his hand with her cold nose, when her water bowl was empty, a gentle but firm reminder of his new duties. It was a simple touch, but for Caleb it felt like a bridge, being built across a vast frozen chasm. The puppies developed personalities as distinct as their markings, The largest of the trio, a bold male with a lightning bolt-shaped patch of white on his chest, was a whirlwind of fearless, clumsy energy. Caleb started calling him Bolt. Bolt would launch himself into heroic, ill-advised assaults on Caleb's boots, tumbling over his own paws in a flurry of uncoordinated limbs. He would rescue a piece of firewood from the woodpile, dragging it with immense effort and depositing it proudly at Caleb's feet. This foolish heroism, this pure, unadulterated joy, in the face of a world that had almost ended him, sparked a flicker of something long dormant in Caleb. Amusement. He found himself watching the puppy's antics, a small, unbidden smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The other male puppy was Bolt's, opposite. In every way, he was the smallest of the litter, the one Caleb had wrapped in Elena's scarf. His fur was a shade darker, and he moved like a shadow, always observing from a safe distance. He was cautious, watchful, his intelligent eyes seeming to hold the trauma of their ordeal. He would flinch at sudden noises, and often sought the darkest corner of the cabin to sleep. Caleb saw a reflection of his own haunted vigilance in the small creature. He named him Echo. Ha. Echo was the one who would quietly approach when Caleb was lost in thought, placing a tentative paw on his knee, or resting his chin on Caleb's boot, as if sensing the man's inner turmoil. The bond with Echo was different, quieter, deeper, rooted in a shared understanding of pain. The third puppy, a female, was a calm and steady presence, a perfect blend of her brother's traits, Spurstain. She possessed Bolt's confidence without his recklessness, and Echo's sensitivity without his fear. Caleb simply called her Grace. She was the peacemaker, the one who would lick Echo's face when he trembled, or patiently endure Bolt's boisterous attempts at play. The three of them, along with their noble mother, had not just invaded his space, they had begun to systematically dismantle the walls around his heart, one muddy paw print, one wet-nosed nudge, one trusting sigh at a time. On the fourth day, the storm had passed, leaving the world buried under a pristine blanket of white. Caleb knew his supplies were running low, especially the kind of food a nursing mother and growing puppies required. The thought of going into town, of interacting with people, sent a familiar surge of anxiety through him. But the imperative to provide for his new family was stronger. He bundled up, checked on the sleeping dogs, and for the first time in months, drove his old truck down the winding, snow-plowed mountain road. The town of Havenwood was just as he remembered it, small, quiet, and intimately interconnected. He felt the weight of curious eyes as he parked in front of the general store. He was the town recluse, the mysterious ex-military man in the isolated cabin. He got what he needed, a 50-pound bag of high-quality puppy food, canned meat, rice, and a few essentials for himself, and was about to make a quick escape when a voice called his name. Caleb Vance. I thought that was your truck. He turned to see Martha, the unofficial matriarch of Havenwood. She was a small, bird-like woman in her 70s, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that held a wisdom as deep and ancient as the mountains themselves. Martha had lost her own son in Afghanistan, and she was one of the few people who had ever looked at Caleb, not with curiosity, but with a sad, knowing empathy. Martha, he said, his voice a gravelly acknowledgement. Her eyes, sharp and missing nothing, flickered from his face to the enormous bag of puppy food in his cart. A slow smile spread across her face. Well now, she said, her tone warm and gentle. Looks like the mountain delivered something other than snow to your doorstep. It wasn't a question, but an observation. Caleb found himself unable to lie or evade. A German shepherd and her litter, he admitted, the words feeling strange in his mouth. They were in the storm, Martha simply nodded. The good Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he uses a blizzard and a stray dog to get a man's attention. She reached out and placed a small, wrinkled hand on his forearm. Her touch was surprisingly firm. They'll need more than just kibble. A nursing mother needs calcium and nutrients. I have some goat's milk and some old blankets at my place, and I make a bone broth that can bring a dead man back to life let alone a half-frozen dog. She didn't ask if he wanted help. She simply stated what was going to happen. Follow me home. It's on your way back up the mountain. Caleb found himself nodding, a strange sense of relief washing over him. The burden of this new responsibility, a burden he had chosen but was still learning to carry, was suddenly lighter. At Martha's cozy cluttered farmhouse, she loaded him up, not just with broth and milk, but with old towels, a worn-out dog bed, and a dose of practical wisdom. As he was leaving, she pressed this small jar into his hand. This is a salve, for cuts and cracked paws, or for hearts that have been frozen too long, she added softly. He looked at her, and for the first time he let her see the crack in his armor, the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. Thank you, Martha, he said, and the words were not just polite, but deeply felt. He was driving back up the mountain, his truck filled with supplies and his mind filled with Martha's gentle wisdom, when he realized he hadn't thought about Alana or Rex with a pang of sharp, debilitating grief. Instead, he had thought only of getting back to the cabin, back to the warmth, the chaos, and the four-legged family that was waiting for him. The introduction of Martha's bounty transformed the cabin further. The scent of simmering bone broth joined the crackle of the fire, a rich, savory aroma that spoke of nourishment and home. Sheba lapped it up greedily, her coat already looking shinier, her eyes brighter. The puppies, fortified by the goat's milk, grew more rambunctious. Bolt's heroic escapades became more ambitious, while Echo began to venture out from his shadowy corners, his tail giving small, tentative wags. Caleb watched them, a feeling of deep, quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. This was a new kind of mission, one without weapons or enemies, but with a clarity of purpose that had been missing from his life for too long. Protect, nurture, heal. A week later, a different kind of vehicle made its way up Caleb's long, winding driveway. It was a white truck with the official seal of the county on its side, Animal Control. A man in a crisp uniform stepped out, a clipboard in his hand. Caleb's body went on, immediate alert. He moved to stand in the doorway of the cabin, his large frame blocking the entrance, a silent sentinel. The dogs, sensing his tension, went quiet behind him. Caleb Vance? The officer asked, his tone professional, but not unkind. He was a young man, probably 10 years Caleb's junior, with a serious face and a name tag that read Miller. Caleb just nodded. Sir. We received a call, Miller continued, gesturing vaguely towards the town below. Someone, a Mr. Henderson down the valley, reported a German shepherd he thought was his, one that went missing a few weeks ago. Said she was pregnant. When he heard you'd bought puppy food, he put two and two together. Caleb's blood ran cold. The thought of losing them, of having this fragile piece shattered, was a physical blow. She's not his, Caleb said, his voice flat and hard. She came to me in the blizzard, half dead. He abandoned her. Miller sighed, a look of weary resignation on his face. Look, sir, I'm not here to argue about that, but the law is the law. The dog and her pups are unregistered. They need to be brought into the shelter for a mandatory hold and evaluation. We have to check for chips, assess their health, and follow procedure. Mr. Henderson has a claim, and we have to investigate it. The words, shelter, hold, procedure, sounded like a death sentence to Caleb. He pictured Sheba and her puppies in a cold, concrete kennel, separated, terrified. He imagined Bolt's boisterous spirit being crushed, Echo retreating back into a shell of fear, Grace losing her quiet confidence. No, Caleb said. The word a command, not a request. They're staying here, Officer Miller's jaw tightened. Sir, I understand you've grown attached, but these aren't your dogs. You're a former serviceman, right? You understand the importance of rules and protocols. The comparison was like a knife twist. Miller was trying to appeal to the soldier, the man of discipline. But he was no longer just a soldier. He was a guardian. He was a protector of this small, fragile family. My protocols are to protect those under my charge, Caleb stated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that had made enemies of the state tremble. And they are under my charge. Sheba, as if sensing the confrontation reaching a critical point, chose that moment to appear at his side. She pushed her way past his legs and stood beside him, not aggressively, but with a quiet, solid loyalty. She looked at Officer Miller, then up at Caleb, and let out a soft woof, a clear declaration of allegiance. Bolt and Grace tumbled out after her, while Echo peeked from behind the doorframe. Miller looked at the scene, the powerful, protective man, the noble mother dog standing steadfast at his side, the puppies frolicking at his feet. His professional expression wavered for a moment. He saw not a recluse hoarding stray animals, but a family unit, unconventional as it was. He sighed again, this time with more frustration than resignation. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "I don't want to take them. I really don't. Twy. But Henderson is making a stink. The law says I have to give you a formal notice. You have 72 hours to voluntarily surrender the animals for evaluation. After that, I have to come back with a warrant." He scribbled on his clipboard, tore off a sheet, and held it out. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. My hands are tied." Caleb didn't take the paper. He just stared at Miller, his eyes like chips of granite. 72 hours, he repeated the words, tasting like ash. The officer, unnerved by the intensity of Caleb's gaze, simply placed the notice on the porch railing, gave a curt nod, and retreated to his truck. Caleb watched him drive away the white vehicle, a stark clinical intrusion in the natural beauty of the forest. A ticking clock had been set. A new storm was gathering, not of wind and snow, but of bureaucracy and law. He looked down at Sheba, who nudged his hand reassuringly. Well, he was being forced to declare his emotional investment, and he realized with a startling clarity that he would fight for these dogs with the same ferocity he had fought for his country, for his brothers in arms. They were not just dogs. They were his mission. They were his family. The 72-hour deadline hung over the cabin like a guillotine. The peace Caleb had found was replaced by a gnawing tension. He paced the floor, his mind racing through tactical scenarios, legal loopholes, and escape routes. He felt cornered, the walls of his sanctuary closing in. He called his sister, Leah, an act of desperation he hadn't resorted to in years. Her voice, bright and full of a life he'd left behind, was a shock to his system. "Caleb, is everything okay?" she asked, her immediate concern a testament to how rarely he called. He explained the situation in clipped, practical terms, omitting the depth of his emotional attachment. But she heard it anyway. She heard the tremor in his voice when he mentioned Echo, the grudging affection when he described Bolt. She promised to look into legal options, to find a lawyer who specialized in animal welfare cases. But she knew, and he knew, that the law was a slow, blunt instrument. He also called the one person in Havenwood he trusted, Martha. She listened patiently as he laid out the facts. That James Henderson, she clucked disapprovingly, never was any good. Left that poor dog tied up for days on end. She didn't run away. She escaped. There's a difference. Martha promised to talk to people, to gather testimonies about Henderson's neglect. Sometimes, she said, her voice firm, a community's conscience is a higher law than what's written in some dusty book. Her words gave him a sliver of hope, but the clock was still ticking. On the final morning, with only a few hours left, the unthinkable happened. The tension in the cabin had been palpable, and the dogs felt it. Sheba was restless, pacing between the door and her puppies, a low whine constantly in her throat. Caleb was outside, reinforcing a section of fence, his mind 1,000 miles away, when he heard a frantic bark. It was Bolt, but it wasn't his usual playful yelp. This was a bark of genuine alarm. Caleb dropped his tools and sprinted back to the cabin. The door was ajar. Sheba and the puppies were gone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his military discipline. Sheba, in her infinite motherly wisdom and terror, must have decided that the only way to keep her family safe was to run, to take them back into the wilderness she had so desperately fled. She didn't understand about warrants and deadlines. She only understood the primal threat of separation. He saw their tracks in the thin layer of morning snow, leading away from the cabin and up the mountain towards the treacherous snow-packed ridges of the higher elevations. A new front was moving in. The sky was a bruised purple, and the wind had a familiar biting edge. Another storm was coming. Without a second's hesitation, Caleb's mission snapped back into focus. This was the second ordeal, the ultimate test. He burst back into the cabin, grabbing his heavy-duty pack, stuffing it with emergency supplies, thermal blankets, high-energy food, rope, a first aid kit, his old combat injuries. The shattered bones in his leg, held together by pins and plates, screamed in protest as he moved, a dull, throbbing ache that he ruthlessly ignored. He strapped on a pair of snowshoes, grabbed his rifle, not for any human threat, but for the very real danger of bears or mountain lions, and took one last look at the empty hearth. He had to find them. Failure was not an option. He followed the tracks, his progress swift and sure-footed despite the deepening snow. He was in his element again, a hunter, a tracker. But this time, he wasn't hunting an enemy. He was tracking his heart. The trail led him higher and higher, into terrain that was increasingly dangerous. The wind picked up, whipping snow into his face, obscuring his vision. He called their names, his voice swallowed by the growing storm. Sheba, Bolt, Echo. He found Bolt first. The foolish hero had gotten himself into a predictable jam. He had tried to cross a narrow, snow-covered log that bridged a shallow ravine and had slipped. He was now clinging precariously to the edge, his front paws scrabbling for purchase, whining in a mixture of fear and frustration. Caleb carefully made his way down the slippery bank, talking to the puppy in a low, calm voice. "Hang on, buddy, I've got you." He secured a rope around a sturdy tree, looped the other end around his waist, and rappelled down the few feet to the terrified pup. He tucked Bolt inside his coat, the puppy's shivering body a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, and hauled himself back up. He followed the remaining tracks, which now showed signs of panic. They led to a place Caleb knew well, a rocky outcrop with a shallow cave, a place where animals often sought shelter. As he approached, he saw Sheba at the cave entrance, barking frantically. Grace was beside her, but Echo was nowhere to be seen. Sheba ran to Caleb, nudging him urgently towards the cave. Inside, he found the source of her terror. Echo, the watchful, fearful soul, had wedged himself deep into a narrow crevice at the back of the cave, terrified by the storm and the echoes of his past trauma. He was stuck. Caleb set Bolt down with his mother and shone his flashlight into the crevice. Echo was wedged tight, whimpering softly. Caleb tried to reach him, but the opening was too small for his broad shoulders. He talked to the puppy, trying to coax him out, but Echo was paralyzed by fear. The old Caleb, the cold and detached soldier, might have written the situation off as a loss. But this new Caleb, the rescuer, the father, refused to give up. He took off his heavy coat and began to chip away at the rock around the opening with the butt of his knife. The repetitive, jarring impacts, sending jolts of pain up his arm and through his aching leg. It was slow, grueling work. The storm raged outside, and the temperature in the cave was dropping. He was so focused on his task that he didn't hear the approaching vehicle, its engine straining against the snow. He didn't hear the footsteps until a voice cut through the wind. "Vance, what in God's name are you doing?" It was Officer Miller. He stood at the mouth of the cave, his face a mask of disbelief, his uniform dusted with snow. He had come to serve the warrant. "I need help," Caleb said, not stopping his work. "The pup. He's stuck." Miller hesitated, the clipboard with the warrant still in his hand, a symbol of the bureaucratic world that had no place here in this life-or-death struggle. He looked from the determined, desperate man chipping away at solid rock to the terrified mother dog and her other two pups huddled at the entrance. He saw the rope, the snowshoes, the evidence of a frantic, dangerous rescue. He saw a man risking everything for these animals. In that moment, the officer saw past the uniform and the rulebook. He saw a man's heart. "All right," Miller said, dropping the clipboard in the snow. It was a surrender. "What do you need?" For the next hour, the two men worked together. Miller, smaller and more agile, was able to reach further into the crevice. Guided by Caleb, he was finally able to get a loop of rope around Echo's hindquarters. Gently, painstakingly, they worked the terrified puppy free. Caleb immediately scooped Echo up, wrapping him in a thermal blanket, murmuring reassurances. The puppy, trembling but safe, licked his chin. As Caleb held Echo, with Bolt and Grace now huddled against his legs, and Sheba resting her head on his knee, Officer Miller looked on. He finally understood. "James Henderson officially withdrew his claim this morning," he said quietly. "Martha went to work on him. The whole town, apparently. Seems he didn't want to be the man who took a war hero's dogs." He bent down and picked up the forgotten clipboard, a faint smile on his face. "For the official record, I came up here to serve a warrant, found no animals at the residence. Then I got stuck in the snow and you came and rescued me. My report will reflect that." He looked Caleb directly in the eye. "You should get them registered, though. I can help with the paperwork. We can call them rescue animals, which I guess is exactly what they are." The journey back down the mountain was a different kind of procession. It was slow, triumphant, and whole. Caleb carried Echo, Miller carried Bolt, and Sheba and Grace trotted proudly between them, a family reunited and safe. The storm was already beginning to break, shafts of pale sunlight piercing the gray clouds. When they reached the cabin, a small crowd was there. Martha had arrived with a thermos of hot coffee and a pot of stew, and beside her stood a woman, with kind eyes and a practical, gentle demeanor. Sarah, the town veteranian, whom Martha had called just in case. The cabin, which had felt so empty just hours before, was suddenly filled with warmth, light, and the low, comforting murmur of friendly voices. Sarah examined the dogs, declaring them exhausted but remarkably healthy. Martha bustled around, ladling stew into bowls, her presence a comforting anchor. Officer Miller, his uniform now rumpled and damp, accepted a cup of coffee and sat on the edge of the hearth, scratching a contented Bolt behind the ears. The fortress of solitude had become a bustling, welcoming haven. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself. It was a rhythm of life, not just survival. Sarah became a regular visitor, initially for checkups on the dogs, but soon for long talks with Caleb on the porch. She spoke of her work, of the joy and heartbreak of caring for animals, and she listened as he, slowly, haltingly, began to speak of his. He told her about Rex, not just his death, but his life, the funny way he would snore, the intelligence in his eyes. He even one quiet evening unlocked the back room and showed her Alana's paintings, the crimson scarf now lying on an open table, no longer a relic in a box but a part of the story. The town, led by Martha, embraced Caleb and his pack. People would leave bags of food on his porch, or stop him in town. Not with curious stares, but with genuine questions about how Bolt's training was going, or if Echo was feeling braver. Caleb, in turn, found a new mission. With Sarah's help and the town's support, he began to formalize his rescue efforts. He started the Echo Foundation, a small nonprofit dedicated to rescuing and retraining working dogs, military, police, and service animals, and finding them homes where they could live out their days in peace. His cabin, his land, became a sanctuary, not just for him, but for other wounded warriors, both human and canine. One crisp autumn evening, months later, Caleb sat on his porch swing. The setting sun painted the mountain peaks in hues of orange and deep purple. Sheba lay at his feet, her head resting on his boot. Grace was asleep on the top step, and Bolt and Echo were engaged in a spirited game of tug-of-war with an old rope, their playful growls echoing in the twilight. Sarah sat beside him on the swing, her shoulder brushing against his, a comfortable, comforting presence. He looked at the scene before him, the chaos, the joy, the profound, unshakable peace. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn harmonica, an instrument he hadn't touched since before the war, since before Elena. He brought it to his lips, and after a moment's hesitation, played a simple, mournful tune, a song of loss and memory. But then the melody shifted. It grew stronger, more hopeful, weaving a new theme of resilience and redemption into the old lament. Echo, hearing the music, abandoned his game and came to sit by Caleb, resting his head on the man's knee, his once fearful eyes now calm and full of trust. Caleb finished the song and looked out at the darkening sky, a genuine smile gracing his face. The ghosts were still there, he knew, but they no longer haunted him. They were simply a part of his story, a part of the long, winding path that had, against all odds, led him out of the storm and into the warmth of a new home. He had been a soldier, a warrior, a recluse, but now, surrounded by his found family, he was simply a man who had been rescued by the very lives he had set out to save.